So, welcome everyone. We're going to give a moment or two for attendees to log on as we get ready to begin tonight's program. No, no, thank you. Okay. Okay. So, good evening and happy Black History Month. I am Imani Capri, and I will be your host and moderator for this third webinar in the fifth annual Black History Month Brain Health Webinar Series. I am an independent journalist and the host of my own award-winning international radio show called Conversations and Courage with Imani Capri that airs on Tuesdays here in Cleveland, Ohio. I'm also a certified Reiki and meditation coach, and I do a few other things, but I won't list all of that out this evening. But thank you for joining us today. This program is presented by the Cleveland Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, or CADRC. This federally funded grant brings together the Cleveland Clinic, university hospitals, Case Western Reserve University, the Lewis Stokes VA Medical Center, and Metro Health Medical Center to function as a research center without walls, dedicated to advancing the study of Alzheimer's disease and memory loss. To continue with our weekly series, we'll begin tonight's program with a brief celebratory presentation highlighting African American pioneers and their accomplishments. This presentation will also provide background and context related to tonight's topic. Following the presentation, we will transition into a discussion with our esteemed panelist. As a reminder, this is an series. So we encourage you to submit questions at any time using the chat or Q&A features. Toward the end of the session, we will ask the questions that you, our audience, have submitted throughout the session, or we may flex a little bit and flow some of those questions into our discussion. But please feel free to put your questions in the chat if you have them when you have them. Tonight's discussion is entitled Enhancing Brain Health, Addressing Psychosocial and Cognitive Stressors in Special Populations. And we are pleased to be joined by Dr. Sierra Carter, Dr. Ann Nudian, and Dr. Nathaniel Harnett. Before we begin the panel discussion, it is my pleasure to introduce Lindsay Campbell, who will deliver tonight's celebratory presentation. Lindsay Campbell, formerly Powell, grew up in Shaker Heights, Ohio, where she graduated from the Shaker Heights School District. She earned her bachelor's degree in the biological basis of behavior with a minor in chemistry from the University of Pennsylvania. Lindsay currently serves as a Level 2 research coordinator at the University Hospital's Brain Health and Memory Center, where she works with the Cleveland Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. She is a proud member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated and a dedicated advocate for minority health. Lindsay recently published her first paper as lead author, titled Understanding Brain Donation Decisions, Predictors of Indecision and Change Over Time, from the Cleveland Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. So now we'll toss it over to Lindsay for her presentation.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and welcome everyone to our week 3 of our 5th annual Black History Month series. I'm very excited to be a part of this series. I am going to share my screen so we can get started with the PowerPoint presentation. Okay. All right, so tonight's topic is titled Enhancing Brain Health, Addressing Psychosocial and Cognitive Stressors in Special Populations. And tonight we'll be discussing two main topics: how psychosocial stressors can affect cognitive health, as well as why Black representation in research is essential to understanding the impacts of these psychosocial stressors. But first, we will begin tonight with our historical highlight. Tonight, we'll be highlighting two groundbreaking psychologists, Mamie Phipps Clark and Kenneth Clark. Mamie Phipps Clark was born in 1917 in Hot Springs, Arkansas, and Kenneth Clark was born in 1914 in Harlem, New York. Their paths crossed later in Washington, D.C., where they both attended the HBCU Howard University, earning their bachelor's and master's degrees. Together, they went on to make history as the first African Americans to receive doctoral degrees from Columbia University. And it was Mamie's thesis that would develop into their famous doll experiment, which we'll discuss on the next slide. In 1946, they opened the North Side Center for Child Development in Harlem, and it was the first full-time child guidance center in the area that offered psychological and casework services to families. Kenneth Clark continued to break barriers as the first African American full tenured professor at the City College of New York, the first African American to be president of the American Psychological Association, and the first African American appointed to the New York State Board of Regents. The Clark's doll experiment was published in 1937, and some of you may already know of this famous doll experiment, but for those who don't, this experiment involved Black children between the ages of 3 and 7 who were shown two dolls that were identical except for their skin color. The children were asked to respond to certain requests, such as, give me the doll that is the nice doll, or give me the doll that looks bad. And the results from the experiment showed that a majority of the children attributed the more positive traits to the white doll and the more negative traits to the brown doll, even though when asked, the children recognized that the brown doll looked more like them. This experiment revealed the deep psychological impact of racism, showing how discrimination can shape a child's self-image and create feelings of inferiority. Their research became powerful evidence in the landmark 1954 Supreme Court case, Brown v. Board of Education, which ruled that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional, leading to the integration of public schooling. In fact, the Clarks served as expert witnesses in this very case. And through their research, the Clarks helped change the course of American history. The Clarks' research is one example that highlights the importance of diversity, or in this case, Black representation in research. However, in order to promote research in this community, we must first discuss the sordid history that the Black community has had with research. Unfortunately, there have been various examples of research-related transgressions towards Black individuals. One such transgression is the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. This experiment involved studying Black men with syphilis to see how untreated syphilis would affect their bodies over time. These men were enticed with incentives such as free meals and free medical treatment for minor illnesses in order to persuade them to continue their participation in this study. At the time that the experiment began in 1932, there were a few mildly effective treatments for syphilis. And though the participants were told that they were receiving these treatments, they were in fact receiving little to no treatment. In 1947, penicillin was developed, which was shown to be a much more effective treatment for syphilis. The researchers, however, never informed the participants that a new, more effective treatment was available, and instead continued to study how the disease affected their bodies for another 25 years. In 1973, a class action lawsuit was filed and awarded $9 million to the affected families. Another transgression involved that of Henrietta Lacks, a Black woman whose cancer tissue was unknowingly collected and studied. Her cells were determined to be immortal meaning that they were able to replicate infinitely in a laboratory setting, unlike other cells, which tended to die after some time in these same settings. Because of this immortality, researchers were able to study numerous diseases and conditions, and her cells were used to produce scientific discoveries, such as the polio vaccine. Her family, however, was not informed of the collection or use of her cells until 20 years after her death, and they were never compensated despite the many innovative therapies her cells have helped create and still help to create in the present. Research transgressions such as these have unfortunately created an understandable hesitancy within the Black community regarding research participation. Accordingly, many policies have been developed in response to transgressions such as these in order to ensure the safe, transparent, and ethical conduction of research moving forward. As stated earlier, tonight's webinar is titled Enhancing Brain Health, Addressing Psychosocial and Cognitive Stressors in Special Populations. But what does this mean? Psychosocial stress is defined by the American Psychosocial Association, the American Psychological Association, as any life situation that creates unusual or intense levels of stress, which may contribute to the development or aggravation of a mental health disorder, an illness, or a maladaptive behavior. Cognitive stress is defined as stress that arises from engaging in mental tasks or challenges. Examples of these two types of stressors include unstable finances or housing, loss of a loved one or a relationship, complex work concerns or environment, or interpersonal discrimination such as racism, sexism, ageism, and even microaggressions. Special populations are defined as any group of individuals who are especially affected by or require extra care regarding a certain issue. In this case, this certain issue that we're referring to would be the psychosocial and cognitive stressors that I just mentioned. And for the purposes of tonight's Black History Month webinar, the special population that we'll focus on is the Black community. Thank you everyone for joining. Here are my sources. I hope everyone has a wonderful, engaging time tonight. And I hope that tonight's presentation serves as a guide to help foster tonight's conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay. What a powerful presentation. Now it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's panelist, Dr. Sierra Carter, Dr. Ann Nguyen, and Dr. Nathaniel Harnett. Dr. Carter is an associate professor of clinical psychology and associate director of the Center for Family Research at the University of Georgia. A common theme throughout much of her work has been examining how racial discrimination as an acute and chronic stressor affects development and exacerbation of chronic illnesses and stress-related disorders across the life course for Black Americans. Her interdisciplinary research program integrates psychology, biology, public health, and developmental science, providing evidence that racism is a multi-level influence that undermines health across the lifespan and over multiple generations. The existence of entrenched racism requires development of culturally informed, prevention-oriented interventions among underrepresented populations capable of responding to the unique challenges confronting them. And three, the deeply entrenched nature of racism requires dissemination of finding to affected populations, policymakers, as well as to fellow scholars. Her research aims to aid in improved identification of mechanisms that can be targeted in prevention and treatment efforts to reduce racial health inequities. Welcome, Dr. Sierra Carter. Next, we have Dr. Ann Nguyen, an interdisciplinary scholar who received her doctoral training in psychology and social work from the Program for Research on Black Americans at the University of Michigan's Institute for Social Research. Her research broadly investigates psychosocial determinants of mental, physical, and cognitive health and well-being across the life course among Black Americans, with a special focus on mid and late life. Her research has investigated the effects of social relationships, for example, social support, social isolation, and loneliness, religious participation, and discrimination on a range of health and well-being outcomes. Thank you and welcome, Dr. Nguyen. Next, we have Dr. Nathaniel Garnett. Dr. Garnett is a neuroscientist whose research is focused on understanding the brain basis for why some people are more likely to develop stress-related disorders, such as post-traumatic stress disorder after trauma. His current work leverages magnetic resonance imaging, MRI techniques, including functional MRI, structural MRI, and diffusion-weighted imaging to identify multimodal neural signatures of PTSD susceptibility in the acute aftermath of trauma exposure. The overarching emphasis of Dr. Harnett's work is on elucidating neural circuitry linked to acute and long-term development of post-traumatic syndromes and identifying robust and generalizable neurobiological targets for early intervention and treatment. Ultimately, the goal of this research is to develop predictive and preventive neuroscience-based techniques to reduce the prevalence of trauma and stress-related disorders. So again, thank you and welcome to all of our panelists. We are grateful to have you here today. I just want to say I'm not a scientist, and man, those were a lot of words, medical terminology. Um, and I hope I did okay with sharing that. But nonetheless, thank you for joining us. We are ready to jump into our discussion. And so, the first question I would like to start with, and this is for all of our panelists: how does the cumulative impact of chronic stress, such as from traumas or racism, affect cognitive aging and neurological disease risk? And any of the panelists can jump in for this.
Well, I can jump in if the other panelists don't mind. Perfect. And so, in terms of chronic stress, because the way of our society is structured, racism is really pervasive throughout our lives. And racism profoundly shapes people's social position across the life course. So, from birth until later life, and it influences people's access to opportunities and resources. It also shapes who is exposed to more stressors, the type of stressors people are exposed to, for how long are they exposed to those stressors, and the resources that people have to deal with stressors. So all of this can create like a cascading pattern of cumulative advantage or disadvantage from birth through later life. When cumulative advantage or disadvantage is a research term that we use, but essentially, simply put, the rich gets richer and the poor gets poorer. So these cumulative disadvantages really can affect where we live. For example, the conditions of the neighborhoods that we live in, how safe is our neighborhood, the environmental exposures that we experience within our neighborhood. For example, living next to a landfill or next to the highway, the interstate, or living near a manufacturing plant. It can also affect opportunities that we have, such as access to education and educational quality, in particular for K-12 education, which is linked to Alzheimer's risk and dementia risk. And it can also influence our opportunities for our occupational trajectory. It also has an effect on socioeconomic resources, such as income, wealth, who we interact with, and the types of interaction we have, whether they're supportive interactions or negative, stressful interactions, such as microaggressions or discriminatory interactions. Where and when we seek care is also affected by all of this. So, are we going to a family doctor or we're going to an ER, right? Or whether we're receiving preventive care versus acute care. So, we're not really seeking help until things are pretty bad, given the resources.
I want to jump in. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have another question. But thank you for your thorough answer. And this goes to show us how important this topic is, especially in this time. This is another question I'd like to put out to the panel. Why is representation of Black individuals in brain health and neuroscience research so important for understanding these impacts?
I feel like,
Okay, go ahead.
oh no, you know what? You go first. I feel like I don't want to interrupt.
You will not. But I will go quickly so that we can also hear from you, Dr. Harnett. I think what was just said is so important about kind of the structures. I think it was a beautiful job of discussing all these difficulties that come across the lifespan. And so when we think about representation, what happens in our science is we call it kind of weird science. Most of our research is done with white, cis, male, middle class individuals, right? And if we don't have representation, what could end up being considered the reason why there are disparities in health is because there's something biologically wrong with Black people versus all the things that were just mentioned, right? All of these systematic, structural, racist experiences being a big part of this lifespan experience and probably the cause of a lot of experiences of racial health disparities that we see, including Alzheimer's disease. So, what ends up being a high risk when we don't have representation of Black people is there's a misattribution of the cause often.
Mhm.
And another thing that can happen is we couldn't understand what could be culturally salient factors or culturally involved factors that differentiate how people experience racial trauma, for example, or racism, and how that leads to cognitive decline. So if we don't have diverse samples, what we can end up doing is generalizing what trauma means for everyone. So we have white people and most of our samples. So this must be the reason why we see, these health disparities for white people, but we generalize it to everyone. So this is the treatment we're going to give to everyone without recognizing that racism, particularly how we think about oppression for Black lives, looks differently amongst us versus other groups. And we have to use that knowledge with representation of Black people in our studies to be able to think about the actual interventions that are rooted in the cause of racial injustice to actually solve the issue of racial health disparities. I'll stop there.
Thank you. I'm just so excited about this topic because it is a challenge being a person of color at this time. And, sometimes it may be difficult to get the greater public to understand that racial trauma is a real thing. And then to have professionals like yourselves giving factual information about the impacts that racial trauma has on health is very timely. I want to ask, what steps can individuals and families take to help protect cognitive health while navigating ongoing stress from sources such as discrimination, especially now? And that's for anybody. Dr. Harnett, how about we toss
It's
that one?
so interesting that when there's a neuroscience question, I won't answer, but now that we have a question that's more sort of individual and family on discrimination, I now need to talk about how to protect cognitive health. So, I'll pull back the curtain a little bit and say that, I've already seen this question. I've seen like a couple variants ahead of time. And I thought long and hard about how to talk about this. And I'll say that quite frankly, I often dislike this question, and I think we'll get to it once we're a little bit further on. I think
Okay.
that it's very easy to talk about individual things that people can do to manage stressful experiences that they have, right? We've heard many of them before. You practice good sleep hygiene, you eat nutritious foods, you go and get exercise. And my lab's done this too. We have plenty of studies showing that different aspects of how we live our lives are associated with better outcomes after you experience trauma or stress. But I think what we're probably going to get to, and I think Dr. Wynn did a really good job of laying this foundation, is that a lot of what we're talking about are not sort of individual failings that people experience, right? It's not as though people experience racial discrimination or psychosocial stress as one sort of thing. It occurs in a larger context in the way that our society is sort of formed. And so it's not just that you're experiencing this interpersonal issue, it's happening in these sort of broader social, economic, and political dynamics that, for the most part, are really outside your individual control. And so I think that when we talk about these individual things that we can do, and I welcome more thoughts from the actual clinical psychologists in the room to talk about this, I also think it's important to frame the discussion around what are the sort of structural things that we need to be managing, that we need to be pushing for change in, that are actually going to help individuals and families to protect their cognitive and overall health. Which is a long-winded answer of saying I don't really like this question. And if other people want to jump in to say, here are things we could actually do structurally, I'm happy to pass the
Okay.
baton.
Well, maybe you like this question. This one is also directed to you. Can you explain the concept of weathering and how repeated exposure to microaggressions, racism, and other traumas affect the brain and our stress responses?
No, no, I can't address that. No. So the concept of weathering very broadly is this idea that Black, Brown, and other marginalized individuals face this sort of multifactorial stress. They're experiencing stress from individuals, they're experiencing stress from other structures as you build up, right? So not just interpersonally, but also societally, institutionally, and so on and so forth. And this happens again across social, economic, and political domains. And that cumulative impact of that stress across all these different domains, across all these different levels, is likely what contributes to broad disparities and deteriorations in health that we see among those marginalized individuals. And when we talk about these sort of repeated exposures to microaggressions, racism, or trauma, what we're really trying to get at here is that the brain and the body have these adaptive ways of trying to deal with stressors or challenges that we face. We all do it every day. I'm doing it right now. I've been put on a webinar. There's a camera facing me. That's a pretty stressful situation for some of us. Maybe you guys are fine. Maybe people have done this more than I have. But you have this sort of initial stress response. You have sort of activation of what people might call the HPA axis or hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, if you need more neuroscience terms. It's basically a system that helps press out these sort of hormones that allow us to deal with the stressor in the moment. Perfectly reasonable, perfectly adaptive. When we're talking about weather and we're talking about these sort of cumulative impacts, we're really talking about a stress system that doesn't have the opportunity to return to its normal. You develop
Mhm.
something that we might call allostatic load. And it's the idea that you really can't bounce back to what your baseline is supposed to be until you get more stress. It sort of builds up to this new baseline where it's still not exactly where you need to be to sort of reset the system and get it back to working at normal. And it just builds and builds and builds and it keeps putting further stress.
Mhm.
And that's what we're sort of talking about and the way that these things contribute to other downstream sort of health outcomes.
So, if I'm understanding you correctly as a lay woman, this stress and the cumulative effect of the things you just talked about changes like what is considered our normal baseline or can, and it's higher, which then makes us more vulnerable to having health issues. Is that correct understanding?
Yeah, that's the overall mechanistic
Basically.
model of
Okay.
what we think is happening, right?
Okay. I have another question for you before we move on to Dr. Wynn. Are there coping strategies or interventions that research suggests may help buffer the brain against the effects of prolonged psychosocial stressors?
Yeah, I think the answer to that question is a little bit the same as the other one. And I'll give a little bit less of a cheeky answer this time, in that a
Okay.
lot of the things that we think impact behavior also necessarily impact the brain. They're two interconnected systems. And so things that help with general body behavior therapy practices, whether that be cognitive behavioral therapy, other types of meditation, other types of mindfulness, all those things can be helpful for modulating the response to psychosocial stressors and are associated with what we might call overall brain health. Forming strong social community ties, having a strong social support system is one of these things that we know is very much tied to having good responses to stressors or traumas that you encounter. And I just think that as we discuss those things, we have to keep in mind what Dr. Wynn and Dr. Carter already said is that these occur in larger societal contexts that determine whether or not you even have access to those things. If you're living in a neighborhood where there aren't a lot of behavioral health centers to, seek support for stress that you're experiencing, yeah, your health outcomes are going to be a lot worse. If you live in a neighborhood where there is frequent sort of trauma or stressors that you have to be aware of, that impacts whether or not you're going to be able to get help. And so I think that as you're thinking about these individual things, keeping them in mind with the broader context of why you may or may not have access to those resources.
Thank you. Dr. Carter or Dr. Wynn, I'd like to give you an opportunity if you'd like to add anything to this question or the previous questions that were put to Dr. Harnett.
No, that was beautiful, Dr. Harnett. The only thing I would add, and I think you are conveying to that, is another individual thing that kind of hits both the structural and the interpersonal, so us as individuals, is not internalizing racism as your own fault. So this self-blame that happens across the lifespan, but particularly amongst children and adolescents, where the cause of why I'm not able to get ahead or the cause of why I'm experiencing cognitive decline is my own personal failings versus that there is possibility or a likelihood that these are all structural racism problems that we need to be thinking about, and I can be a part of the solution with we call it critical consciousness of how we engage in political action that really tries to hit at that structure, right? So if I can identify that, hey, there is something wrong with why am I disproportionately experiencing these traumas? Why am I not having access to healthcare in the ways that I would benefit my health? It is not my fault. This is something that I need to think about for my system, the communities that I live in, to support all Black people living well. And I want to be a part of that fight and revolution.
I'm so glad you said that because I think we need more of that in our community, like just the reinforcement that we don't have to internalize the messaging, the effects of the stress, and to also give us some relief that it's not all our fault, that there are structural things that are causing the stress, right? I'd like to share a comment from someone who's in the chat. Yvette Hunt says, a change in the collective consciousness must begin. It may not be in our lifetime, but I think if humanity changes their thinking for the better, the next generation has a chance. Thank you, Yvette Hunt, for sharing that. And I think webinars like this um, can help us move towards positive change in our lifetimes, right? So that we have better health outcomes. Dr. Nguyen, how does social isolation, or before we go to that, Dr. Nguyen, do you want to respond to anything that Dr. Carter just shared or said?
No, I think Dr. Carter did an amazing job, as well as Dr. Harnett, in terms of framing for us, how can people cope and deal with psychosocial stressors, as well as the responsibilities, or whose responsibilities it is for, reshaping how these events play out as well. So thank you both.
This question is for you, Dr. Nguyen. How does social isolation or exclusion, particularly in racially segregated or unwelcoming environments, increase cognitive risk?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, social isolation, I think before we talk about the neighborhood component, it's important to talk about why social isolation can impact people's brain health really negatively. And it's really because people who are socially engaged are also cognitively engaged. So if you're socially isolated, you're not socially engaged, therefore you're not cognitively engage. And on top of that, there's a lot out there, a lot of research out there that shows how bad for your health social isolation is. I think a lot that gets quoted is this finding that people who are socially isolated, they take a hit to their health. It's equivalent to somebody who smokes 15 cigarettes a day. So it has also outside of brain health impacts. It also has physical health impacts as well. So now when we layer in racial segregation into this, this complicates the situation even more because racial segregation can lead to social isolation. Oftentimes, racially segregated neighborhoods experience a lot of economic, social, and political disinvestment that are beyond the control of residents. And this disinvestment leads to neighbor conditions that make it more difficult for neighbors to socialize with each other and increase the risk for social isolation. So, for example, neighborhoods that feel unsafe, people are less likely to spend time outside of their homes, especially in the evening. So, when you're not spending a lot of time outside of your home, you're less likely to meet neighbors or to socialize with neighbors. Or in the case of older adults, neighborhoods that have sidewalks, don't have sidewalks, or sidewalks that aren't kept up with, sidewalks with big cracks in them, they represent fall risks for older adults. That kind of condition would discourage older people from walking outside of their home, spending time outside of their home. I will mention that at the same time, racially segregated neighborhoods can also have characteristics that reduce social isolation. For example, racially segregated neighborhoods tend to have a greater sense of community and solidarity because of the shared culture, history, norms, lived experiences, and faith traditions. So, people who live in segregated neighborhoods are more likely to also live near their relatives, which means these are people who are living nearby that the residents can count on, can depend on for social support. So I want to be perfectly clear that I'm not arguing that racial segregation as an institution overall is positive or beneficial to health or society. However, the point that I'm trying to get across is that despite some people's best efforts to marginalize an entire segment of Americans, there were unintended consequences that strengthened Black communities from these acts. And this is really a testament to the strength and resilience of these communities.
Thank you. We have a question from the chat. How does one know how to keep from internalizing racism if one does not attend a webinar like this?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
I think the onus is on us. So not on the people, but on us as psychologists, as researchers, as advocacy individuals, because I think sometimes we end up being in our silos and not doing webinars like this or engaging in interventions that are structurally laden. And what we know is that earlier is better when we start thinking about racism as a chronic stressor and how we talk about the cause with our children, with our adolescents, right? We have so much social media right now and how we are seeing daily how oppression works out. And these conversations naturally can come up with our kids. And I think within school systems, reasons for example, low grades, reasons why you're not liked by your teacher, reasons why you feel like, I just can't get ahead. Like I see all my friends experiencing all these traumas around me in my community. Why is that happening? And having a conversation that includes interventions that we know can be effective. We have different interventions, some by Dr. Rihanna Anderson, related to how we have conversations about racism and race, as well as by other scholars at the center that I work with that's related to strong Black families, that kind of names what's happening and allows this critical consciousness development from young because we recognize that racism has this chronic course, right? So if we can hit it in some ways for individuals early enough, we might be able to offset some of the race-related stress. And I agree with Dr. Hannah and Wynn about like, it's not on us to reduce the stress, it's a structural problem. But because we have such limited, right now, in particular, structural changes that are happening with regard to racial oppression, sometimes we have to rely on us. And I do think there are structural interventions that can engage people to be critically conscious, have a understanding of like why am I not succeeding? who is to blame here that doesn't always involve us internalizing. So I think we need to be broader as us, as clinicians, as researchers, as advocates to combat this, to provide more knowledge about what's happening so that the public can understand and be thinking about talking to their children about this, about why are things happening that lead to racial health disparities.
If I can
Thank you.
add to
Mhm.
what Dr. Carter was saying, very beautifully put. And I would add that, echoing Dr. Harnett, comments on thinking more at the structural level, as well as Dr. Carter's comment, I think that, we really need to shift our conversation away from individual level interventions in terms of dealing with psychosocial stressors. Because I think when we talk about or focus on individual level interventions, it feels almost like victim blaming because we're asking the people who are harmed to figure out how do we fix racism. Whereas, and that seems, it doesn't seem fair to ask the people who are most harmed, how can they fix the system, right? And so I think shifting our focus to more structural level interventions, policy level interventions, I think can also shift that narrative away from internalizing and thinking that, if only I acted this way, said things this way, or coped better, or had more resources to deal with these things.
Absolutely. And in the chat, several people have said excellent point, Dr. Nguyen. We have another question from the chat. What can we do to bridge the lack of awareness to the way negative psychosocial experience impacts Black people? And could incorporating psychosocial services into physical health services be key for anyone who wants to respond?
So I'll jump in. I think, as academics, we're kind of stuck in our ivory tower. Some of us are better at not being stuck in our ivory towers than others. But I think that academics in general need to do better in terms of disseminating their research, especially publicly funded research that is funded by taxpayers' dollars. So we're pretty good at disseminating our research in terms of like publishing in academic journals or presenting it at conferences, but we need to really present in places where lay people actually spend time. And so, one, we need to look for those opportunities. But two is when those opportunities come looking for us, we need to say yes to them because so often we have other demands that interfere with us saying yes to them. But we have to understand that this is a value for us and the impact for us to disseminate our research, to talk with lay people about our research. So that's one way I can think of, getting the word out to lay people.
Yeah, I like
Dr.
that.
Carter?
Can
Mhm.
I say something real quick? I
Sure.
like that a lot, Dr. Nguyen, but I also think one of the things I see as a clinical psychologist is that Black people are experiencing racial trauma and experiencing psychological effects related to that. We see high links to PTSD with racial trauma. And a lot of people sometimes are saying, I don't feel validated going to someone and my experiences of racial trauma. And I think this kind of how do we talk to other people about what's happening? Although I completely agree as an interdisciplinary scientist that the structure needs to change. We need to think about these structural policy level things. I see people every day, Black people every day, who are saying, I am struggling. And so I
Mhm.
have to think through as a clinical psychologist, like, what can we do when people, if we don't acknowledge that racism is a chronic stressor, like other types of traumas that lead to mental health problems, that lead to physical health decline? So I think we have to have both and conversations. I don't want to isolate saying that there aren't anything that we can do for people who are
Mhm.
experiencing chronic stress from racial trauma in the moment is influencing their mental health. I think we as psychologists, but also as providers, have a lot of work to do to name and acknowledge that as stressors for Black people. But I think to answer that question, I think we have to really think about how psychological services don't do this kind of mind and body integration work really well. And I think we can
Mm.
do a lot of work ourselves as a profession to provide more holistic services for Black people that include mind and body wellness if we acknowledge that racism is a chronic stressor that can affect our ability to live long lives.
And just to very quickly, I'll be 30 seconds, add on to that,
Oh,
Dr.
sure.
Carter.
No
I
problem.
think like if we're going to continue self-flagellating in academia, I do think that that acknowledging of racial trauma thing is one of the big things that we're struggling with in the field is that there are certain ways of conceptualizing stress and trauma, and that gets distilled through academics and then down to TikTok and then down to social media. And then we have one specific way of talking about it that excludes the ways in which people might actually experience other things. I mean, we're just saying racial trauma right now because we need to differentiate it, even though I think most of us on the panel would probably agree, it's probably just trauma. Like we can probably just call it a traumatic stressor. And so, how do we start to have the conversations both within our own academic circles and how do we sort of change that narrative as we move down? I think is just one difficulty that we're all trying to figure out now.
And I would love to add, this is such a rich question and conversation on this particular question, but as someone who is not really in academia in the way that you all are, I would love to see more of these conversations with experts like you at a more grassroots level. Like if there's workshops at coffee shops or at libraries, this information taking to lay people where lay people are in language that helps validate what many people are feeling, but also give tools to help them understand, I think would be one of the very impactful ways that we could help get this great information out. We have a couple of more questions from the chat. Can you expound upon the racial traumas on children to help them navigate our society with minimal impact on their mental and behavioral health?
Is that question for me? It might be.
Whoever wants to take it.
I'll be kind of quick.
Okay.
One of the things I teach a Black psychology class, and one of the things that we talk a lot about is the fear of having to take a child's joy by talking about
Mhm.
racism.
Mhm.
And one of the things that we know from research is that just like how we talk about trauma, the conversations need to happen and need to happen in a way that we call it racial identity, how we uplift cultural pride while giving information about oppression. And we know that if you only do, we call it preparation for bias messaging. If you only do preparation for bias messaging, where it's like, you have to work twice as hard as white people. You have to, like, you can't be doing the same things as those white kids are doing. You know, those alone can be somewhat not as great as talking through, like, I think you are beautiful. I think you
Mhm.
are so smart. And the reason why these things are happening is because other people might see you in a way that I do not. And I want you to know that I think you can do anything. I want to talk through why people think about you in this way or might think about you in this way and why it's wrong. Right? And you can have that conversation. We know that kids start to develop understanding of racial differences as early as 3 and 4. And so we can understand like there are different ways to think about developmentally those conversations, but the conversations we know, we call it racial socialization, how parents talk to their kids about race and society and racism. And there's a big body of literature, often marginalized, so not given the dissemination efforts that it deserves, often by Black scholars, where we know that if you do the conversation, if you have the talk, that can be effective in reducing mental and physical health problems down the road for children. And so we are really talking through like, hey, because we have so much social media in particular, a lot of parents are asking, what does this conversation look like? And we have the knowledge to actually talk through that.
I love that. Thank you. We have another question from the chat. How do psychosocial stressors affect inflammation of the brain and body, and how do we combat that? Anyone who wants to take that one.
I'm happy to jump in and give a bad answer, and then Dr. Carter, who I know has done a lot of work on the biomarker side, can jump in and save me. So, again, a lot of what we're talking about when we talk about racial traumas or racial stress is just trauma and stress. And we know that these things impact different physiological responses that serve to prepare us for whatever sort of challenge we're experiencing. And so when you experience significant stress, you have this activation of different stress cascades, both that HPA axis I mentioned before. You can have immune system activation. All of this is meant to help fight whatever challenge you're experiencing in the moment. And again, it's that sort of overload of stress, that constant chronic cumulative stress that you experience that tends to have this sort of signature of neuroinflammation or body inflammation that's associated with all these other downstream outcomes. I think one thing that I wanted to say again is that I think in some ways, how do we combat that is not always like combating the inflammation isn't what we want to do, right? We want to combat the psychosocial stressors that are causing that inflammation. A lot of what our brains and body do or does are completely adaptive. It makes total sense if you live in an area or you experience something very traumatic to have hypervigilance in that area. It makes perfect sense for your body to be preparing itself for something bad that might happen if you've experienced bad things in that environment. And it's part of the reason, going back to what both Dr. Carter and Dr. Wynn mentioned about sort of structural change, we have a lot of treatments for different psychiatric disorders that really rest on the premise that whatever stress you've experienced is in the past, that you can change the way that your body's working because you're not in that stressful situation anymore. It's not like you're not likely to experience that trauma again. When we're talking about racial trauma, we're talking about these things that we know you're experiencing routinely throughout your life. That might not be the case. And so I think that shifting this a little bit to understanding that the brain and body are adaptive systems to help us survive the things that we're experiencing and really focusing on how do we change the occurrence of those psychosocial stressors? How do we change the likelihood you'll experience it? How do we change the environment? I think that's really where the effort needs to go.
Thank you. Dr. Carter, what has research shown regarding stress biomarkers and accelerated brain aging in Black populations?
Well, I feel like Dr. Harnett has already taken us home a lot of ways around this question. I think one of the things I'll just add to answer this question is how we get to accelerated brain aging is a lifespan experience. So if we acknowledge that racism is a chronic stressor first, because we still have a hard time with that. So I don't want to, so I think one of the things that really I see is often people like researchers, policymakers will not acknowledge that racism counts as a chronic stressor first. But if we can acknowledge that it's a chronic stressor that has this lifespan ongoing effect on mental and physical health, then we can start to pinpoint why it affects our mental and physical health that leads to the disproportionate health disparities that we see amongst Black people. So this allostatic load and weathering has led to things in the Black community that we know are health disparities consistently across generations, like hypertension, diabetes, cardiovascular health decline, all influencing Alzheimer's and cognitive decline, right? So these things are connected, right? And so when we think about why this happens, and particularly we think a lot, Black women in particular have high levels of allostatic load.
Mm.
Even when we account for social economic status, other forms of trauma. I do a lot of work in maternal health. One of the stark things that happen that we know is like Black women who have high SES have some of the highest rates of low birth weight
Mm.
when they give birth. So the ways in which chronic stress, if we acknowledge that racism is that stressor, we can begin to say the wear and tear to our body regulatory systems that Dr. Harnett talked about that's related to weathering and allostatic load. These body regulatory systems can influence what we think about when we think about cognitive decline. What happens is naturally what our body naturally does to combat stress is adaptive, like Dr. Harnett is saying, right? We're trying to adapt to an environment that is stressful. So we're using a lot of our cognitive brain power to say, oh, okay, is that racist? Or, oh, how do I get out of this traumatic experiences that I'm disproportionately impacted by because of structural racism? And so my body is constantly working so that I can survive. And that constant working is what's influencing this cognitive decline that's influencing Alzheimer's and brain health, Alzheimer's disease and brain health. And we have to think about what that does, even though in the moment and all these chronic experiences, it's adaptive to want to survive. It's
Hmm.
adaptive for our body to want to survive these uncontrollable environments. And so we have to think about naming racism as a stress biomarker and then thinking about how it fits with other stress biomarkers.
Thank you. That answer really was resonating. I want to share one. Uh-oh, I think I talked out of the screen. Another quick question, anyone can respond. Has anyone explored or researched the people, institutions, etc., that are exhibiting racism?
So I will say that there is research out there. I think much less than research that looks at interpersonal discrimination, such as like microaggression, everyday discrimination. I don't do research in this area, so I really can't speak to it very well. But I do know that it's out there, but we do certainly need more research in that area.
Dr. Carter, I do have a closing question for you, but did you want to say something in
Yeah.
response to Dr. Wynn? Thank you.
Yeah, Dr. Wynn, you're right. And so some of my work is based in Black communities saying, hey, we know we experience racism. You need to ask all these other providers and stuff about why they
Hmm.
keep doing it. So that was one of our grants that was particularly in medical settings, so medical providers and their engagement in racist practice. And so one of the things that we found is what we call a colorblind ideology. So this idea that I am giving people equal treatment, all races are equal, that leads to this idea, this racist action in actual practice. And we see it in practice that leads to a lack of empathy in providers across races. So if we think about structural racism as an existence in medical settings, a
Hmm.
lot of races can engage in that practice. And what we notice is like when we think about stereotypes against Black women, for example, Black women experience less pain when we think that there's this colorblind ideology, then we, instead of thinking about root causes for things that are happening in a Black woman's life, we think about behaviors. So, if all things being equal, why are you having problems? It must be something you ain't doing, right? You're lazy, yeah, you ain't trying hard enough, you know? So like we really look at what are these ideologies that hold because
Mm.
of how historical legacy have been practiced, and they all play out in how we think about medical practice, but we think it subsumes to other systems as well. And there's been a lot of research on how the colorblind ideology impacts the continuation of structural racism practice.
Absolutely. There's one last question I'd like to ask, and we do have to wrap up here. But Dr. Carter, this question is for you. If you could give us maybe a brief response. Given the historical abuses in research involving Black communities, how do you suggest we approach building trust and encouraging participation today? That kind of dovetails into what you were just talking about.
Yeah, so I think we have a lot of work to do in this area still, but I believe in what we call community-based participatory research, where instead of saying we as the research are the experts in Black lives, this is not research about, this is research with the communities that we want to serve. And that includes that the community is a part of the research, they are authors in the research practice. Right now, we have what we call community advisory board, where stakeholders that the community has identified are the individuals who are influencing how we write research questions. It's really hard right now to get funding in that space, but we recognize that that is essential to building trust and validating that trust is not naturally granted because I'm a Black woman doing this research, because all the things that Lindsay Campbell talked about, the Tuskegee, Henrietta Lack, is valid mistrust. So let's
Yes.
start there. This is valid to mistrust me
Yes.
because we are the ones who have caused harm.
Mhm.
I want to see what that means for me to build trust. And that is why I've stayed in Atlanta because I think one of the big components of building trust to engage in research is long-standing relationships, right? This is not me taking, this is me giving. So a lot of things we do is we give data give back. So we give the data back, we ask what that means to people. We ask where do we move forward? Did we get it wrong when the research that we did in the past amongst Black communities? What can we do better? So, really engaging communities and thinking about what does trust building actually look like, where we try to reduce the power disconnect.
Mhm.
And that's all in community engaged research and practice.
Thank you so much. We do have to wrap up, but before we close, I want to share just one last comment from the chat, and then I will ask each of our panelists to give us maybe just a brief final closing thought or takeaway. But Onia Daniel in the chat says, I think it's about shifting culture and the acceptance of racism that has happened and is happening to the Black and Brown community. The denial of it perpetuates the trauma and makes our norm a lie, and that traps the Black and Brown community over and over again. This conversation has been very affirming and validating
Mhm.
for me as a host. So I know, looking here in the chat and people who will see this in the future, that this will give a sense of validation, information, understanding, and hopefully expand community through this webinar. For each of you, the panelists, I'd like to ask you briefly to share a final thought or key takeaway that you'd like for the audience to remember from tonight's discussion.
I can start us off. So I think, for it's really important for us to think about reframing the narrative we have around equity and inclusion. And, I do kind of want to expand on what Dr. Carter had talked about in terms of building trust with the communities and elevating the voices of community members. I would say, in addition to that, kind of echoing our conversation about reframing how to deal with racism, putting the burden on the structure, the system. I think in terms of increasing research participation, a lot of the narrative around that is how can we change people of color's minds and attitudes around research because of the historical harm that has been done. What we hear less is what can we change about the characteristics of the study that would make it more probable for people of color to participate in. And one way to do that is community-based participatory research, as Dr. Carter has mentioned. But in particular, with Alzheimer's research, there are a lot of characteristics for these studies that make it difficult for people of color to participate in. Black people are more likely to be screened out of an Alzheimer's study than white people because they don't meet the study criteria. So that means these are people who want to and are willing to participate in research, but they're unable to because they don't meet the eligibility criteria. Sometimes there are study requirements that are just too burdensome for people from certain communities to participate in. For example, if you have to come to the university or the hospital or the clinic, and you don't have reliable transportation or you don't even have transportation at all, a lot of times with cognitive impairment, dementia, Alzheimer's research, these studies require a study partner. And some people do not have study partners, do not have somebody that they are in contact with weekly that they can also bring with them to the hospital or to the clinic to participate with them for these studies. So again, I think we really need to shift our mindset to think it's really important to think about the individual, but also think at the individual level, institutional level, what can we change in order to make research more equitable?
Thank you, Dr. Harnett and Dr. Carter. A brief final takeaway for us, please.
I'm happy to just co-sign what Dr. Nguyen already said. I mean, I think what you've all heard today is that this is a fascinating topic and it's also very complex. There's a lot of work to do at multiple levels to understand brain-body interactions in terms of what exactly are these traumas and stressors that we all endure doing, and how do we work together to form new meaningful partnerships that are going to actually address this for people where they live.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll be brief. I loved everything that everyone has said. And I think the only thing I would add is we're in a really hard social political context for this research right now, and the revolution continues. And so I think, we're dedicated to Black people living long lives in many ways. And as you can see, but there has been a constant effort in erasure. So erasing the research, not showing the research, not showing, this affects us too. And I think it's just important to know that like a lot of the things that you're seeing in the media affects how the research is getting out. And we have to do a lot of work. The work is on us to continue to kind of combat this legacy of erasure of racism related science, racial trauma science.
Thank you. I want to thank all of you doctors for joining us on our panel tonight. Thank you for everyone in the chat who has been participating with comments and asking great questions. That brings us to the end of tonight's webinar. Please be sure to join us next week for our final webinar discussion titled Everyday Technology and the Brain, Empowering Health While Avoiding Harm. This session will explore how technologies such as telehealth, imaging, and smartwatches can enhance health and brain care. It will also address concerns related to algorithmic bias in apps and AI, along with inequities in access to these technologies. All webinars in this series are recorded, and links to the recordings will be mailed to registered participants after each session. Following tonight's session, you will also receive a feedback survey by mail. We encourage all participants to complete the survey each week, even if you are viewing this webinar as a recording. Your feedback plays an important role in shaping future topics and programs. Again, thank you for joining us tonight, and we look forward to seeing you next week.